Good afternoon, Excellencies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. As already mentioned, I'm Mariana Evanstein, and I'm delighted to be guiding this conversation. We're looking at investing at culture at scale, the untapped asset class. Now, we often hear that culture is vibrant, it's growing, and yet many institutional investors are still hesitant. And the kinds of things that we often hear about are concerns over risk or inadequate scale or also a lack of established financial models. So today, with our very esteemed panel, we're going to be taking a look at new approaches to financing and investment and how they could unlock capital flows into the culture sector, and also perhaps how Saudi Arabia could be a leader in this space. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. We're very honored to be joined by His Excellency Rakan Al Touk. He's the Assistant Minister of Culture for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Welcome. Also joining us is Noah Horowitz. He's the CEO of Art Basel. Hello to you, Noah. And Charles Stewart, CEO of Sotheby's. So, gentlemen, great to have you. We are in Saudi Arabia, so I'd like to begin with Saudi Arabia, where culture, of course, is a pillar of Vision 2030. And Your Excellency, Saudi Arabia has really put culture at the heart of its strategy. Can you perhaps begin by telling us a little bit about how the kingdom looks at cultural investment, and also what kind of models are already being put in place to support the growth of the sector?
Well, thank you, Mariana, and I'm very pleased to be here with both Noah and Charles. It's a very important topic, and I think it was wonderful to listen to everybody preceding us talk about the importance of investment capital flow into the culture and creative industry space. I think we heard some large numbers about how large the contribution is from creative industries into global GDP today. His Excellency, the Minister of Economy, mentioned around 4 trillion. This is a clear signal of the viability of and the commercial viability of this industry, of these industries in general. When this ministry, the Ministry of Culture, started developing the National Culture Strategy, investment and private sector capital flow was always a central part of how we thought about sustained development. And what was clear is on a global level, but as well as within Saudi Arabia, there is a translation problem, if you will, between the financial world and creative industries. The creative industries cannot speak and package things in ways that the financial world can understand, and the financial world sees perhaps reductively the cultural and creative industries as either luxury consumption only or philanthropic activities. So that's something that we've continuously tried to think about. I think in Saudi Arabia many measures have been put in place, and we continue to iterate and think about ways to do this. The truth is, government spending and investment into the cultural space will always play an important role. Capital, public sector capital, can and will always play something like a first money in, last money out platform setting role that's very important. On that platform, economic activity can be built, whether it's by corporations, individual investors, or the philanthropic community as well. What's clear is the government government spending can tolerate longer duration for return. Government can also accept returns that are not necessarily direct economic, but accept these external social benefits, which is a burden that perhaps typical commercial actors will not stomach in the same way. We can look at government activities even in very mature cultural sectors. One of our largest partners in the cultural sector is France in general. We recently saw an announcement to heavily invest and expand the annual visitation numbers to the Louvre Museum from 8 million to 12 million. You think about an asset like that is a very, very mature and august institution. getting such investment. That's purely a decision that must have been made with an eye on an increased visitation, increased ticket revenue, and increased income for the Louvre. In the Ministry of Culture, we look at things in a bit similar way. We look at these important flagship assets, such as museums or important UNESCO World Heritage sites throughout the kingdom, and think about these as the platform-setting places where government investment can create not only a return for the country nationally, where our objectives for national unity, social cohesion, sense of pride in the kingdom, and heritage preservation are met, but our objective to unlock economic activity on top of this platform is done. We also are looking at different models now for different ways of public-private partnerships. The important thing here is to bring in the private sector not only on small activities, but to think about the private sector as an infrastructure developer, as a real estate developer as well. I'll give an example. Some of the audience may know the Jax district in Diriyah. Jax is a former warehouse, network of warehouses that was taken over by the ministry. The Diriyah Biennial Foundation was set up as an anchor tenant within that district. It became the home of the kingdom's first contemporary biennial. But Jax evolves to become a landlord now for creative production companies. It becomes a landlord for art studios. And this idea of bringing in a halo effect, if you will, from a government-supported initiative, but create outsized returns for private capital is really a way to solve this translation problem. Cultural districts themselves are great sort of contributors to city economies in general through an uplift in real estate prices. Noah would know Art Basel moves into a city and consumer spending increases even if Art Basel is there for a short time. I think in Miami, there's probably an uptick of just during the few days that they are there of $500 or $600 million in people spending within Miami. So just like an anchor tenant can sort of uplift, the idea is to create this cohesive, distributed sort of return effect, a distributed REIT, if you will, with that asset. You can deliver sustained returns for multiple stakeholders at the same time. I think looking at models like that continuously for us will be how we try to incentivize more and more capital to flow.
So, Your Excellency, you mentioned also this lingering false idea of culture as something just that's luxury or it's about philanthropy. And one of the other barriers, it seems, for global investment in culture is the challenge of treating it like an asset class, and how do we evaluate? So valuation is really, really difficult. How do we measure the value of culture? And this is really a problem for investors looking at their returns, because if they can't value it, they're not as likely to want to back it. So that makes sense. Charles, I'd like to turn to you because I know that Sotheby's recently helped stage the Origins auctions in Diriyah, Saudi Arabia, which was huge. So more than $17 million brought in, and also Saudi artists given a new global stage. So that was really a tremendous milestone. And yet, again, as I just said, culture is still not viewed as a fully credible asset class by many investors. So what do you think needs to happen to change this mentality, this mindset, this perception?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be on stage with such esteemed co-panelists. And I always enjoy coming to Saudi Arabia in particular precisely because of the breadth of the cultural ambition of this country. And every time I come, I feel like you see it, coming to life. This trip has been no exception. We did, as you say, host the first international auction here in Riyadh earlier this year. Fascinating experience for us. We had 5,000 visitors, hundreds of registered clients from locally and regionally, and I think a very successful outcome for a first effort. One of the most popular aspects of the 2 weeks we were on display were our master classes. And I think education is such an important component of developing confidence as a collector in growing the market. The challenge in the art market, visual art market, from my perspective, is we want to see more and more collectors coming into the market. This is a global market that is ranged between $55 and $70 billion a year. And for it to go to 100 billion, you need, 1 million new collectors around the world coming in. And that should be very doable. But to get there, there's a whole series of things that I think need to develop and grow from where we are today. Some of that is geographic expansion, which we're pursuing here, for example. There's technology expansion, there's education, among other components. But when you put all that together, that somehow is the formula to creating confidence and excitement about, committing personal or institutional capital into the art market.
So picking up on geographic expansion, Art Basel, of course, has a track record of acting as a catalyst for market growth in new regions. Also, next year, you'll be entering the MENA region with Art Basel Qatar. So, Noah, just from your perspective, what lessons stand out for you that could help guide how cultural investment can spread more globally?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again for having me. It's great to be here. I think from an Art Basel perspective, our organization is really an amplifier of activity. We're not a marketplace in the same way as an auction house is in terms of accepting consignments. We really elevate a global community of galleries in the primary and secondary markets. So where we locate, it's incredibly important to think of the broader ecosystem of cultural resource. As we've expanded globally, starting in 1970 in Switzerland, in 2002 into Miami Beach, 2013 to Hong Kong, and next month we're in Paris for year 4 in the Paris market. The contours of the city, the country, the region that we're in is incredibly important. Casting an eye on the global expansion of our trade, it's clear that the MENA region, the Gulf, is ripe for opportunity. Infrastructural investment is absolutely extraordinary, and we're here, side by side with our partners in Saudi Arabia, seeing everything that's being built in real time here. As we look ahead to Art Basel Qatar in February, we're incredibly excited to lean in and help through an international fair of the caliber of Art Basel, raise the level and raise attention and create further opportunities for artists, practitioners in the region. We see it as a very rising tides lifts all boats phenomenon. In terms of the lessons that we've learned over the years, I think there needs to be a really dynamic interplay between the private and the public sector. That is imperative. I think having an entrepreneurial approach that spans beyond the market itself into hospitality, tourism. His Excellency mentioned, the legacy of Art Basel Miami Beach, which is, an event now in Greater Miami that contributes on a year in, year out basis nearly $500 million in economic impact. It's larger than the F1 in Miami. And so those resonant sort of outflows into the community, and that's X spending on art. That's hotels, tourism, and so on and so forth is huge. And so from an investment perspective, I think education is huge. Lowering barriers to entry is vital as we see more and more collectors and art-interested audiences that are coming from different backgrounds, many self-made, entering the market is key. And so all of that comes together under the rubric of culture, and we hope to play an important role going forward in stimulating and activating that wherever we go.
So, Your Excellency, you've been listening very carefully. Some of the things mentioned, so education, lowering barriers to entry, infrastructure. What do you think about all of these dimensions? And can you tell us what perhaps the government of Saudi Arabia is doing policy-wise to support these various areas so that they do indeed all together help boost cultural investment?
Well, I think what both Charles and Noah's points show is that the government kind of has a dual role to make this happen. We at the ministry need to play a role to regulate and create a very conducive regulatory environment to make sure that capital flows well, that access to capital can happen easily, that foreign and international investment can come into the kingdom with less and less barriers, with the help, obviously, of other important partners throughout the government of the kingdom. But we also have another role which is very important, which is essentially a communicator of opportunities, a packager and communicator of opportunities. That goes back to this idea of opportunities within these creative industries are not always as easy to define and package for capital to flow. What's important is that in Saudi, domestically, even preceding the establishment of the Ministry of Culture, private individuals, families, cultural pioneers, there's a very long legacy of giving, of philanthropic activity for social and cultural causes. So it's on us really today to think about how do we package the correct opportunities that can channel that existing capital and commitment from investors and philanthropists into the culture sector. In the kingdom, the government is uniquely perhaps placed because the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Culture's ecosystem really has this sort of central bird's eye view about the landscape nationally, both of what's going on in the large giga projects in the kingdom, but our own infrastructure development plans. So it's on us at the ministry to really package these deals. We have within the Ministry of Culture a full investment department that is thinking about how do you make the correct kind of feasibility studies? Do you, as His Excellency the Minister of Investment mentioned, put them up on the Invest Saudi platform, have these communicated, tour around the world to understand the interest of and appetite of international capital to come into these ideas. On the regulatory side, we also know that we have a job to do. And sometimes there is no single magic policy that solves every solution. So it's also on us and a responsibility for the ministry to think about specific and tailored policy interventions that look at specific problems. We've introduced through a small, what we call a cultural policy lab now, a continuous ideation on policy interventions that has yielded many different interventions that hopefully have smoothed out capital flow and activity in the culture sector. One of them is a new policy for what is historically a typical device used in Saudi, which is waqf, which is a traditional endowment, to help endowments for libraries. There's a very large interest in written heritage and literary heritage in the kingdom. So we now have a specific cultural policy intervention to enable waqf or endowment giving in libraries, easing completely the access to the national library system, a very clear financial and legal framework with benefits and incentives for those ideas of giving to happen. We also introduced a new public-private partnership model for theaters throughout the kingdom. There are a large number of theaters in the kingdom. Theaters lend themselves as a cultural asset to be relatively directly monetizable. And private operators can be interested to take them over. So we've also introduced a very clear policy that enables both revenue and up to 60% profit sharing with private operators who want to take over some of the national assets and help with the programming. Also easing any regulatory burdens that take it not only on the operator potentially, but looking at it as a partnership between us and the private sector. We're also looking at options, as you mentioned, the Origins auction here in Diriyah that Sotheby's did, and we're looking at auction houses and auctions to come in Saudi, both also to act as a bit of a catalyst for the art market, to grow a domestic collector base. Yesterday, Charles and I were talking about looking at solutions for incentives, fee exemptions, and customs easing possibilities to think about attracting auctions, more auction activity in the kingdom. This is important again because for us, it doesn't only help Sotheby's or people to come and do their activities in the kingdom, but it helps us grow this domestic collector base, which yields this flywheel effect that was mentioned earlier today. In terms of outcomes, all of these measures, I want to be clear, are not intended to purely shift the financial burden of the cultural sector from the public sector onto the private. The idea is, I hope, is clear, is to do as many measures as possible that grow the size of the pie. There is a role that we should play, as I mentioned earlier, but the idea is to have this overall contribution to the economy increase. And the results so far, even though we are in only a few years in to the National Culture Strategy and on almost the 9-year mark of Vision 2030, is clear. Private sector commitments have already exceeded $1 billion reals in 2024 in the culture sector. Today, as was mentioned earlier, agreements will be announced exceeding 5 billion reals of activity in the culture, in the creative and cultural industries in general. And there's an important sustained aim to look for, which is not a one-time effect of a transfer of capital, but a sustained capital flow into the cultural economy. We have a 2030 target of sustained private sector investment of over 500 million reals annually from the private sector that will help continue the sector to grow. I don't want to completely negate the philanthropic activities in the sector because they're a key component of this, and historically within Saudi Arabia there is a large history of giving. So again, what I hope will happen is through this restructuring of how the assets within the creative industries look like and how easily capital can flow, that encourages even more giving and philanthropic activity into it. So you convert it from a indistinguishable, hard to understand, difficult to think of as an investable asset class, as you mentioned, but to one that has clear ideas on valuation, on exit opportunities, on incentives, and that hopefully yields an effect that is not only good for our objectives in the cultural sector, but as was mentioned earlier, is very important to tangential, important economic activities. The tourism industry benefits from this activity. Our general social benefits and social returns for our domestic society will benefit as well.
We have just a few minutes left, and I do want to get to another very important aspect that's also changing the way investors engage with cultural assets, and also how we can perhaps scale cultural investment, and that's, of course, technology and innovation. And Noah and Charles, I know both of you organizations have really done a lot in terms of innovations and using technology to change how you do things. What impact can that have on investment in a larger scale in culture? So either one of you is free to.
I'll start, then I'll go over to you. Well, I think it gets back to that access and barriers to entry phenomenon. I think one thing is eminently clear, which is that as we scale as a culture industry globally, more and more people are coming to our world, less through, let's say, museums, galleries of old, and more through their phones, through how they consume, how they interact with each other, and how they create communities. And so it's on all of us as an industry to meet them where they are and to leverage tools for transparency, for ease of communication, access, information, visibility, et cetera, to create that. At Art Basel, we've invested substantially in our app development and building bridges with technology partners, whether Microsoft, Samsung, and others over the last 2 years. And so, that's really where we are. There's marketplace elements to that, but ultimately for us, it's really about how do we translate information, accessibility for all the things that our galleries are showing, all the things that our artists are creating, and create a better tool to allow those audiences to meet us. Also then to enjoy the cities that they're in and experience things not just in the halls of our fairs, but in the cities and regions. Again, really cultural as economic investment catalyst that has a lot of scalable outflows from these events and from these touch points.
There's a Sotheby's booth outside this room, and in the booth there is a beautiful painting by a Saudi artist called Safia bin Zaghar, one of the most important Saudi artists, if I may say. And I encourage you to see it. And it's a very interesting question in technology, because in some ways the visual art community is a world of physical objects, and there's no substitute for standing in front of a painting, experiencing it. And digital is not quite there, in my view, to capture the same emotional response that you have when you stand in front of something. At the same time, Noah used the word amplify before. I do think that technology absolutely amplifies and helps you educate. You may not know very much about Safia bin Zaghar. You can go read about her, you can discover, you can watch, you can learn, and that will only increase your interest when you eventually do stand in front of these physical objects, which in a world of increasing digital saturation and certainly AI, I think the visual arts will take on sort of added significance, added meaning, perhaps, as we all sort of understand the meaning of humanity and also across time. That's a longer philosophical discussion. But whether it's education, whether it's awareness, whether it's authenticity, these are all things where there's a huge role for technology to play. We're investing in these capabilities to grow and engage our audiences more significantly. At the very high end of the art market, there are now many collections that are worth hundreds of millions, even billions of US dollars. And how those are going to be owned and distributed in this generational wealth transfer, which is without precedent, is a whole nother question around how institutional investing and tools like fractional ownership, may play into how those collections are passed to the next generation of owners.
We have less than a minute left. Your Excellency, maybe just very quickly, looking to the future, if you could predict what it would look like if Saudi Arabia establishes culture as a recognized investable asset class, how would you measure that success?
Well, we've heard the typical measures, and we have direct targets on GDP numbers and employment and so on. But really, something that His Excellency Khalid Al-Falih mentioned today is left me a bit inspired, which is if we think about entrepreneurial activity within this space, and not only capital flow and typical investment. And we think that, and we sort of paint a picture of multiple unicorns coming out of the Saudi creative industry, that would be something that we can all be very proud of.
Good words to end on. Thank you so much to each of you for sharing your insights. Fascinating stuff.